Paul has been writing, there were total 4 letters that Paul wrote to Corinthian church as it is. And we have only 2 of those letters. The first letter that he wrote, it was also something with respect to disciplining, but looks like the Corinthian church did not take it well. They, in fact, misrepresented what he had said. And as a result, he had to write, the second letter, which is what we have in the form of First Corinthians that we read in our Bibles. Starting chapter 5, we see Paul referring to specific instances which were happening in Corinth church, and we see Paul taking all those issues head on because the church was not willing to play its part. And we see certain harsh decisions being taken as we read through the book of chapter 5. But the point to be noted that Paul is writing this as a spiritual father. As Caleb spoke to us last week, he's writing because he had set up these churches, and in a way he was a spiritual father to many of the congregation that is there, and he's writing from that love and care that they do not fall astray, right? So from that viewpoint, Paul is writing to them and hoping that they would come back to the true light of God. So chapter 5, as we see, as I've titled today's message, it's a transformed church in a way, if it were to accept what Paul had to say. And we see, Church of Corinth moving in that direction. But it has to confront the sin that is within and that is so on your face. It is so glaring. The other one is what the Corinthian church followed, which is licentiousness. And as I said, this is, because of what Christ has done, now I am free to do anything, everything that pleases me. If you read Romans 6:1, Paul is again speaking of the same thing. It says, "What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" So clearly, the worst of the sins can be committed in the church, which even in fact, living in that, culture, even pagans would not approve of. But the church leaders in that sense can be very at peace, are quite fine with it because of this wrong belief, that I just spoke about. And also, one of the reasons for boastfulness, if you see, they have also misinterpreted what Paul has said. Some of the verses that I read, verses 8 and 9, it says, "When I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulge in sexual sins." But I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sins, or are greedy, or cheat people, or worship idols. Then you might have to leave this world. So Paul in first letter had mentioned this to this church, saying that you're not to associate with folks who do these things within the church, but they had misinterpreted it, saying, these are people of, unbelievers. And Paul's contention is, if that is the case, then you would have to leave the world, because outside the church there are people doing all sort of things, and we have to be the ambassadors of love. In New Testament, if you see in 1 Thessalonians 3:6-15, he speaks again of a person, of certain people being handed over to Satan, so that while their flesh can be destroyed, but their spirit can be saved for salvation. And also we see a similar reference in 1 Timothy 1:20. So we do not know the exact nature of how God will work. If a person is out of the congregation, perhaps he enjoys some sort of security which comes from being in the body of Christ, being prayed over, being in that fellowship. When he's out, he's in the world as any other person. A toast for perhaps Satan to work to his logical conclusions because of the sinful nature that he has. So it is in that reference that Paul is saying. I like what one commentator says about this, and I just want to read it out. Do you see the nail over there on the wall? That nail is mine. You cannot remove it. You cannot put anything up on it. And more importantly, I can put whatever I want up the nail, but you cannot take what I put up down there. The young man said, "Wow, this is amazing." So I like the deal, and he thought, "What possibly can this old man put up there? Possibly a picture. So I'll ignore it. That doesn't matter." Several months passed, and one day the young man heard a knock on his door, and to his surprise, it was this elderly man. The elderly man said, "I want to buy this house back." And the young man said, "No, I'm sorry, this is not for sale. I've paid you the full price and this is mine." The old man said, "I miss it. This is my home for long, and give it back to me." The young man said, "You sold me this house. It is mine, and I want to live in here for a long time. I'm not going to sell this." Then the old man stormed off with a very furious rage. So next day, the young man heard a knock on the door, and it was this old man again. But this time he was carrying something in his hand. It was a carcass of a dog. The old man barged into his house and hung the dead dog's body on the nail which belonged to him, and he left. The young man tried to ignore it, but the strong stench soon filled the whole house. His clothes began to stink, the furniture smelled all horrible. Even the walls began to share the smell of the carcass. The young man then burst out from the door. He couldn't take it anymore. Just across the road sat the old man smiling. The young man shouted, "You win, you take it. This is your house. Now it is ruined." Sometimes that is the condition with us, while Paul specifically talks about the church here. But even in our personal life, these are certainly the small sins, the small leaven, because of which possibly we would have to vacate the whole house, and the enemy has a foothold in our life.